so happy that you're here today. Oh, my old neighbor Heidi is coming on. Okay. Um, I'm glad that everyone is here today. And this is the of, the fifth session I've been doing, a fifth Permission to Thrive conversation. Started them in February, and it's hard to believe it's June already. We've done sessions on everything from mindfulness to empathy to organ donation, and this session I'm very excited about because obviously I wrote the book, and so writing has been a huge part of the story over the past 12 years for me. And connecting to faith has been one of the benefits. So I wanted to introduce Faith to everyone. She is, I guess everyone can see her in the top corner. I'm very happy to have her with us today to share her story and to share her experiences with writing and how writing can be very healing in the grief process. So, most of you I know, but I wanted to start out by sharing a little bit of my story, and then introducing Faith. She'll explain some of her story, why she wrote her book, and her experience with journaling. And then we'll have time to ask questions, answer them. We'll go back and forth, and feel free during the presentations to write your questions in the chat room, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I guess I'll begin. And for my story is 12 years ago, we had 3 healthy daughters, and my oldest daughter, Laura, was 14 at the time. She was a freshman in high school, and she had headaches for a few weeks that got worse. And still she went to school. And on a Wednesday morning, she woke up, she threw up several times. She asked me why I had 4 eyes, and she had a seizure all within about 45 minutes. It was that sudden. And so we obviously called 911 and rushed her to the hospital, where she was awake again, but the CT scan showed that she had a mass at the back of her head. And I immediately thought, okay, this isn't good news, but it'll be removed and everything will go back to normal, because that's how our family had survived things. We just had a kind of normal life, that everything went the way we thought it should go. Later that afternoon, they did an MRI, also told us it could be removed, that she would have surgery in 2 days on a Friday. And what happened, though, is the headaches became increasingly worse over the day and into the evening. And my husband and I were with her in the room when she got more pain medication, and she didn't react well to that medication, and she stopped breathing. And so they quickly rushed her down to the emergency, to an operating room, and to put a shunt in to relieve the brain pressure. But when the doctor walked out, you could tell that he said the procedure had gone okay, but she wasn't responding the way they'd like. And the next thing we knew, we were up in the ICU, where she was hooked up to every machine possible. And I just knew as a mom that this was really serious and that she wasn't there. And I mean, this had happened all within 12 hours, and she had been on school on a Tuesday afternoon, and this was Wednesday at like 9 o'clock at night. So 2 or 3 days later, we learned from the final MRI that it was not survivable, excuse me, and that she was declared legally brain dead. So I'm making obviously a very long emotional story very short, because we could be talking about this for many, many hours, and I have with many of you. And I just wanted to share this story because it sets the stage for me beginning to talk to as many people as I could, and to write as much as I could to remember Laura, to share the story with other people. I somehow knew instinctively that this was such a big thing in my life that I needed to share it with other people. And it ended up being that was the only thing that really helped me, is kind of sharing the pain it helped divide it. It helped divide the hurt. So, I mean, I went as far as to share it with the Trader Joe's clerk who asked me, did I have any fun plans for the weekend? I kind of went overboard and told him the entire story while people were waiting in line. So, with that said, some of the reasons that I decided to write the book, excuse me, was that I wanted to record the memories the way I remembered them, and I didn't want anyone else's story to counteract what I remembered. So I wrote it down for that reason. I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget anything about Laura. I remember the first couple of weeks I started just jotting down notes about Laura, about how she liked peach yogurt, or about how she liked playing Monopoly and Boggle, or just little idiosyncrasies that I was afraid over time I would forget. And I would highly recommend doing that about anyone who anyone who has a loved one who passes away, because those memories really were good to look back at. And then I started writing and writing. I'd always journaled as a kid on and off when I was feeling really emotional, and it helped me kind of untangle my thoughts. And now it was even more important that I did that. And then part of my story is that 3 years after the Laura's death, just as we were kind of getting back our footing, I ended up having my own headaches and ended up incredibly getting diagnosed with my own brain tumor. What Laura died of was a childhood brain tumor that was very cancerous and very unsurvivable. And I ended up being diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. But if you can imagine being diagnosed with a brain tumor with the same words that your daughter had been diagnosed, and she had died within a day pretty much, was pretty scary. So I went through surgery for that. And after that experience, I even got more desire to start writing because the experiences were so unusual, and because I just felt that I had a story to tell. And I also learned then about the growth that you can experience following tragedy. And so at first I had a grief book that I thought about writing. And then I had, now I had a book with a more hopeful message that I could, a more universal message. So as you can tell, writing's been a very big part of the last decade plus. And now I was fortunate enough to connect with Faith, who wrote a similar book to mine. And you'll learn from her story where our stories are similar and where they're different. But I think the overarching idea is that there's a certain commonalities of grief that spread throughout stories of having a child die. We each have our own grief journeys, and we each have the own specifics of how the person died and how we reacted in those first couple months or years. But there are some truths that I think resonate. So so Faith, I'll read her bio, and then I was fortunate. Her book was just published June 8th. So her book is hot off the press, and I was able to read it in the last week and very much enjoyed it. She really writes in a very authentic, vulnerable way and talks about how friends showing up was so important. And the idea that you can have grief and joy at the same time. And that really resonated with me. So I'll read her bio. Faith Fuller Wilcox believes that self-expression through writing leads to healing. Her writing is reflective of a growing body of medical research about narrative identity, which illuminates that how we make sense of what happens to us and the meaning we give to experiences beyond our control directly impact our physical and psychological outcomes. Faith learned these truths firsthand when her 13-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was diagnosed with a rare bone cancer that took her life. Faith's journey from grief and despair to moments of comfort and peace taught her life-affirming lessons, which she shares today through her writing. Faith is the author of Hope is a Bright Star, a mother's memoir of love, loss, and learning to live, love, loss, and learning to live again, that was published in June of this year. Faith is also the author of Facing into the Wind, a mother's healing after the death of her child, a book of poetry. A longtime resident of Massachusetts, Faith leads a journal writing program at Mass General Hospital for Children for patients and their families, designed to give participants the opportunity to express themselves, alleviate stress, celebrate victories, and honor their grief. So with that introduction, Faith, why don't you explain a little bit about your story and take the conversation where you want.
Sure, of course. First, thank you very much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be able to talk with all of you. In the year 2000, my daughter Elizabeth was 13 years old. She was an athletic girl. She was on a swim team. This was in the summer. She rode her bike every day, and she started to have pain in her knee. We took her to her primary care physician, who said he didn't know why she was having these pains in her knees, and she was also having some pain in her chest when she was swimming. And about another 6 weeks later, I went to an orthopedic doctor, and the orthopedic doctor told me that she had a shadow around her knee and that I would hear back from him again. We had a x-ray done on Elizabeth's knee on a Friday, and he said he'd get back to me on the Monday. Well, on the Monday, first thing, I received a call from my pediatrician, which was first confusing to me because I thought this orthopedic doctor would get back to me, but the pediatrician did. And he said that, that Elizabeth needed to see a different doctor right away. And he had made an appointment for me the following day on a Tuesday. On the Tuesday, we went in to see this doctor, and I looked at the placard on the wall and it said orthopedic oncology. That was the first time I had ever even contemplated. I had no idea. I was really, really shocked. And I actually stood in front of the placard so my daughter wouldn't see it. But when we were in the room, it was obvious that people had some serious challenges. And some people had one or two legs amputated. Some people had neck braces on. And it was clear to me that we were in a place where people, as I said, have big challenges. Over the next 3 days, Elizabeth had MRIs, CT scan, and one surgery to remove a little bit of bone tumor. And we found out that Friday afternoon that she had a very rare pediatric bone cancer called osteosarcoma. We also found out that it was a very, very aggressive form of cancer and that she would need 10 to 11 months of treatments that would include intensive chemotherapy, radiation, and most likely surgeries. Over the next year, Elizabeth incredibly bravely went through all these chemotherapy treatments. And even in the worst of it, even when she was weak, she still would smile with any doctor or any nurse that came into the room or with me. She, the best she could, retained her humor. She had a wonderful sense of humor. And one thing that she did, which was so moving to me, is that when she was on the hospital floor one day, about halfway through her treatments, she got in her wheelchair. She pulled up her hood to cover her bald head and put on a baseball cap and went and knocked on the doors of a child who had just come onto the floor. She explained what I found out later was that she explained some of the upcoming medical procedures for that child in a way that that child could understand. And the following day, the mother came up to me and said, "We've been so afraid, but Elizabeth helped us so much with because she explained things to us so we could understand. And when we looked at her and saw that she was going through these things and she was okay, it made us feel like we have much, much more hope." Elizabeth continued to do this on the floor for new patients, and she really became kind of the greeter on the floor. This really tragically, her tumors kept progressing despite all the treatments that she had. And in the early part of July, we actually went on a Make-A-Wish trip, which was extraordinarily special. And within a month, Elizabeth died in my arms. My older daughter, who was 18 months older, named Olivia, was bereft as I was. We had been a family of four. I had in this process separated from my husband, who was really unable to be honest, to put our girls first. And that's what had to happen. And our marriage was already fragile. And I actually moved in with my sister, who was throughout this ordeal incredibly supportive. And my older daughter and I were now a family of two. Huge amounts of change going on. She was also new to a new high school. She was 15 years old when her 14-year-old sister died. And they were not only sisters, but they were best friends. So I also had the challenge of not knowing, but having to learn pretty rapidly how to comfort a grieving teenager. I honestly think I did my best. I got counseling to help me with this process. And some of the times we grieved together, and other times we grieved apart. It's very normal for a teenager to pull away from home and to pull away from their parents. And it was very hard at this time seeing her pull away. But I knew that this was healthy, normal behavior. But it was very hard because there were times I just wanted her home more. There were times I needed and wanted to be able to just to be together more. I certainly didn't want to burden her with my feelings, but someone said to me at one time, she was perhaps also trying to protect you by not totally opening up to all of the feelings that she was having inside, which is probably correct. Over time, she ended up going to college and being, for the first time when she was in a new setting, she was in the South, and she felt so much more comfortable and happy there. And our life slowly, slowly, slowly got better where I could find moments of comfort and peace. And I did remarry and had the joy of having a new man in my life and his children and grandchildren. So my life has filled out, and I have learned that you can have sorrow and you can have joy and you can hold them together. And that's really what, for me, life is about, that they're different emotions that you can have, but you can feel both of them and you can be okay. In terms of my writing, I started writing when Elizabeth was first diagnosed. I needed to get all of the feelings that I had that were trapped inside. I needed to get them out, but I was very reluctant to talk about them out loud. So I started writing them down. Not only did I write down about my emotions, but I also wrote down about um, medical procedures that were happening, surgeries, types of chemotherapies, what was to be expected when the unexpected happened. And that helped me enormously because there is so much that happens in a hospital setting. Um, I'm sure many of you have had been in hospital settings, and the information comes to you fast and furiously, and often it's terms that you don't understand. So to be able to write them down and then to be able to go back to them later helped me because I could talk to the doctor or could talk to the nurse and say, can you please explain this procedure better? Can you tell me what's going on? And so it helped to better inform me, and it helped me to feel not that I had some control, but that sort of tsunami of information that was just hitting me, and that tsunami of emotions that was hitting me, writing it down helped relieve some of the incredible stress that I was going through. I later learned, much later, that writing has actually been studied, and they've studied writing with one study that I will talk about a little bit was done in a magazine called Critical Care Nursing. They interviewed hundreds of people who had been in either ICU settings with a family member, pediatric intensive care unit settings, which is called PICU, and neonatal intensive care setting, which is for short called NICU. They interviewed or they spoke to parents, and one group of parents wrote for 15 minutes a day for about a month, and another group of parents didn't write. And they found that the group of parents that did write had better psychological outcomes compared to the group that didn't write. And they were beginning to wonder why. And the parents were able to express a few things. They said they were able to express all of the harsh feelings that they were holding inside. And by able to put them out on paper, they seemed to release some of the anxiety that they had. They also said that by writing things down, it helped them somewhat to make sense of what was going on. Not that it ever was, nothing was good that was happening, but it helped them to understand that in time, like I did, if you can go back and ask about certain terms and certain procedures, you can understand why the doctors and nurses followed certain paths. And so it didn't just feel like all this information was being thrown at you and you couldn't digest it at all. They also asked parents to go back and read their journals after their child had left a pediatric intensive care setting or a neonatal intensive care setting. And they said that the journals helped to give them sort of a framework so that when they were talking to other family members, it started to be able to make sense to the other family members. And in time, especially with a young child, they were able to look back at their journals and explain what was going on to the child, who perhaps was much too young to understand at the time. But they knew that there would be a time and a day when a child would want to know what happened in that experience. So this was very affirming for me. I started writing more, and going back and reading my journals. And the first thing I wrote was a book of poetry. I found if I used a lot of metaphors with the natural world, it helped me enormously, again, in the processing. And later I wrote a book, Hope is a Bright Star. Again, that helped me with the processing that I was going through. And also, I found that there really were some universal truths that I wanted to capture and ultimately wanted to be able to help people who are on the journey of grieving and healing by showing them examples of how this could be done, and how hold up some hope that this could be done in their life too. If you'd like, I can read a poem for you so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about with how I use the natural world to express some of my inner feelings. Just need to find it. Just a moment, please. Okay. Where do I go from here? Where will I begin? My life is so changed from what it has been. Where do I start? Will I sit by a pond in the cool sunlight? Will I walk in the woods, which are anticipating spring? Will I hold my grieving daughter? Will I have lunch with friends and hear news of their families? Will I fold up my dark winter clothes and fill my drawers with the lighter clothes of spring? Perhaps I'll walk in an open, rough field, lined by stone walls, tall pine trees, and filled with whispering winds, where the light is bright and the shadows are few, a field large enough for all my memories to flow through, and where there is room for me to move. I will go into this field and step into something new, each step remembering, each step reconciling, each step guiding me toward a place where I am longing to be.
That's beautiful, Faith.
Lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think what you're showing really beautifully is that how writing helped you process kind of the unthinkable and helped you craft kind of a changed identity, even though it was some identity that you didn't want to ever have. I relate to that quite a lot. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, about narrative identity that you talk about, in the bio that I read. And, what does that mean about, crafting your own story the way you look at it?
Mhm. Narrative identity is a term that researchers have been using to when people have been writing their own stories after having gone through some sort of trauma. And it is a process of starting to make some meaning out of the experiences that you have been through. It doesn't mean that you make sense out of them, but you can draw some meaning from them. For example, when I told you about Elizabeth going into different hospital rooms, I drew out a lot of meaning that my child, as young as she was, understood about compassion and understood that people needed support and people needed love. Really, she was giving out love. And I was not totally surprised because I knew her personality, but I was surprised by the strength that she showed, even when she was literally physically weak, the strength that she showed to go out and to speak to others and know that in some small way she was helping them. Narrative identity and writing about our experiences can also help us understand ourselves better. I think most of us who've been through difficulties find out that we have more inner strength than we thought possible. People will often say to me, I don't know how I would have gone through what you would have gone through, or I don't know what it would have been like. And I say to them, don't try to imagine what it would have been like, because it's good you never had to go through this. But you do find out a lot about yourself, and you do find out a lot about your friends and your family and those around who can support you. And many of you may have had this experience where friends show up in extraordinary ways and you didn't even know that was possible. I had friends who helped me financially. I had friends who helped me by spending the nights in Elizabeth's hospital room sometimes. I would be in the hospital sometimes for 3 or 4 days. And you don't sleep well in a hospital. And I could have and catch up on a needed night's sleep and also spend a little time with my daughter Olivia when I was home and not in the hospital that night. I had friends who came over, made meals, who drove me to the hospital because, especially, I was in a state of shock initially, and it was really deemed that it wasn't safe for me to be driving. And I just appreciated everything that my family and my friends did for me. And it made me realize too that I too had more strength inside than I once thought possible. So writing about your experiences, what they now call what is can be called narrative identity, helps you to make meaning out of your own of of yourself and helps to take some meaning out of the experiences that you've been through.
That's very well said, Faith. And you're basically explaining all of the many of the aspects of this concept of post-traumatic growth, which is you had more gratitude for the things that still remained in your life, and you had added compassion for other people going through similar situations, and you had deeper friendships, and you benefited from that network of your social network, um, and then you relied on nature for the spiritual kind of experience. And I think by writing and by talking about and struggling with the meaning of what happened or the senselessness of what happened, you created a reality for yourself that you could live with. And
Mhm.
I think that's similar to what happened to me is only by going through the pain of it and only by going through analyzing it and um, reliving some of the events, which painful as they were, it helped me go from being terrified and fearful to understanding that there were glimmers of hope that I could hold on to. And I mean, there's a quote, when writing your story, don't let anyone else hold the pen. And I've taken that to heart because the facts are what they were, but I could craft the story any way that I wanted. And it could be a very tragic story that I tell today. And it is a tragic story, but it's how I have framed it that's helped me go from one day to the next. And I think you've done the same. And and I think this concept of post-traumatic growth and writing in this in a way that allows you to keep healing is so important. It's not like you can say to someone who's grieving, oh, you should look on the bright side. I would never recommend that to anybody, but I trying to be the person yourself, the griever who is trying to identify those glimmers of hope. That's where the healing starts. Um, so I have another question for you, Faith. Why did you actually decide to craft to put together your writings into a book form? It's a lot of work. And other than the poetry, you weren't a writer per se.
Right. Uh, it is quite a lot of work, but I just felt compelled to share Elizabeth's story. I wanted to share with the world her strength, her humor, her grace, and I wanted people to know that even young people can bring about extraordinary growth when going through a very big situation and a life-threatening situation. She honestly recognized that she may not make it months earlier than I did. I just wouldn't let that in. But I know how she did this. I know she was thinking these things. She wrote me a note at Christmas time and made a little card and said, think of me wherever I may be. And that was 6 months before she died. And she just had a sense that she may not make it. And I just wanted to share her story with others. And as I went through what I've gone through in my long period of grieving and healing, I just thought it was important for others. There's so many of us who have had some great tragedy in our life. And I just wanted to be able to give people hope that they could in time find ways. For me, I found a lot of ways through the natural world, through my friends, through a therapist, um, through the way that my family just showed up for me in my greater community. I wanted to show people examples of how one can help you, because you do need a big support structure. To do this on your own would be terribly hard, but with a support structure in place, this is something that is achievable, and I wanted people to know this.
I think it's so great that you're able to talk so honestly about your story. And what I've learned through telling mine is this is really like everyone's worst nightmare, to lose a child. We talk about a lot of topics in our life today: politics, sex, religion, money. I mean, some of those are no longer the third rails of conversation, but grief and death still seem to be one of those topics that makes people want to run for the hills and isn't really polite conversation. And perhaps with the pandemic and the collective grief that people have experienced, that will be changing. I hope our culture becomes more comfortable talking about these topics, because every single one of us will experience death and loss in one way or the other. And um, I think these types of conversations are really important to have as a result of that. Um, I have another question or two for Faith, but as I'm asking her, I would love it if anyone had questions or comments to put them in the chat room. while we're doing that, because then we'll have some time to go back and forth with that. Faith, you had mentioned that you had had experience working at children's hospital near you, and working with families who've gone through grief and had children in the hospital, and working with them with writing and journaling for themselves. Can you just talk a little bit about that, why you got into it, and how you found it helpful for them?
Of course, I found that I wanted to somehow give back to parents and children who were struggling. And I thought about starting a journal writing program where my daughter was treated at Mass General Hospital for Children. So I just got big and brave one day. It did require bravery. And I went to the Family Advisory Council, the Pediatric Family Advisory Council at Mass General Hospital for Children. I told them about how journal writing can be very beneficial and shared some of my story. They agreed. This was a group of both doctors and parents who worked together to improve the overall experience of the patient and their families. Because, as in any, whether it's a child or whether it's a spouse, any family member illness affects the whole entire family. And I think Mass General does a very good job at understanding that the entire family needs support. And the Family Advisory Council works at pulling together different ways to support entire families and children during a severe illness. So after I approached them, they then said they're very interested, but they wanted to know some research. And I had a friend, doctor friend, who actually was very helpful in finding some research articles for me. And there were many that I could share with the Family Advisory Council and the physicians about the beneficial effects of journal writing. So I went with about 20 journals a day. And I went, sorry, not a day, about 20 journals a week. And I went to Mass General Hospital for Children. And I ended up going actually into children's rooms. I'd first thought, and maybe in the family room, I would be having parents gather, but I soon found out that parents really didn't like to leave their child's bedside. And I knew that from my own experience. So I went into the rooms with journals. I spoke about the benefits of journal writing. I also included writing prompts and talked to them about the benefits of writing prompts. And I did this for 15 months on Tuesday afternoons. And in those 15 months, I spoke to 785 people, patients and parents, and sometimes it would be grandparents, sometimes it'd be siblings. And more than 80% of them wanted to write. Some of them would start writing before I left the room. Some were familiar with the concept of writing, some were not familiar at all with the concept of writing to try to help. And with the children, I often talked about ways that they could write a story that could actually bring them away from their environment that they were in, or they could remember their favorite times, their favorite places, their favorite friends, and they could write about things that were uplifting to them. I had to stop, unfortunately. The program, it's called Journals of Hope, had to go on pause because of COVID. But now I have in the neonatal intensive care unit and the pediatric intensive care unit, there are nurses, child life specialists, social workers, and spiritual care providers who are continuing on with the Journals of Hope in my absence. So I am really hoping that in some way I am able to contribute to help patients and parents and caregivers when a child is hospitalized.
Um, Thank you for that. Are there certain practical strategies that you would recommend to the people on this call about how to start writing about their feelings, about their grief, about their loss? Because I often talk about grief is not just the loss of a person; it's the loss of a dream or a study abroad program or something that an economic downturn that they faced during the pandemic. how do you get started writing if you've never done it before?
I think here are some practical ideas. I think it's really important first to pick a journal that you really like the cover up and you really like how you hold it and you like um, everything about it because it becomes something sort of precious in time to you. So first buy a journal that you really like. Secondly, there are some there are some books that are good. One book is called Writing Down the Bones. Not Writing as a Way of Healing is another one. And they're books by an author named James Pennebaker, Pennebaker. He writes a lot about the research that he's done, but he writes it in such a way that it's very easy to read. So sometimes being able to read about other people's experiences can help give you ideas about how to start writing. And what I also do is recommend that people have writing prompts. Maybe Susan can share some of the writing prompts that I have on my website, or you can go to my website, which is faithwilcoxnarratives.com. And I do in one of the drop downs in the top menu bar, you'll see writing prompts. So, writing prompts can help you if you're feeling stuck, which I think everybody has that experience at some point. And you can use the writing prompts and you'll start writing about a particular topic. And once you get going, I find that once your pen is moving, you can just keep on going and you'll be changing topics and writing about maybe what you really had hoped to write about. But writing prompts can give you a good nudge to get going in the right direction. And keep these journals and in time read them over again. You can write as little as 15 minutes a day. I think sometimes people feel a little bit overwhelmed thinking, oh, I've got to dedicate an hour a day or maybe 5 hours a week. Do what's right for you. Do what's best for you. It might be first thing in the morning, you write for 10 minutes. It might be last thing at night. You like to write about the day, and that's for half an hour. Whatever's right for you. Don't feel that it has to be turn into some big novel. This is something you're doing as a means of self-care. It's taking time for yourself, certain number of minutes each day or every other day to help you in your processing, as you're processing something very, very difficult in your life.
I think it's great that I think the writing not only, I mean, we've all heard about how gratitude journals are so healing and helpful. And I think it's the same kind of thing. It's a way to untangle your thoughts
Mhm.
when you don't exactly know what emotions are coming at you. And grief is like that. It's this onion of emotions, and you don't even kind of know what you're feeling at the moment. And you can get upset with yourself that you're feeling the way you are and not sure why you were triggered because you woke up feeling fine that day. And then all of a sudden you were standing in line too long at, the grocery store, and it made you upset, or you went through social media and you saw a high school graduation that your child would never have, and that just gets under your skin and you're not feeling so great. And only I think when you start writing things down like that will it kind of come to you. So it really helped me a lot in gathering my thoughts in the book. And then also I was able to go through Laura's writings, and it gave me a reason to go through the condolence cards and um, to go through the memories in order to process them and then be able to move on.
Mhm.
And in that same vein, I need to mention one thing that I probably mentioned before is, writing for ourselves is so important, but don't remember the benefit and the treasure of writing when you reach out to other people who have experienced a loss or a tragedy. Um, I've often said that I would receive piles of cards and notes in the mail in the weeks after Laura's death, and I would open them up while I was waiting at our curbside mailbox, And I appreciated all of them. And I really appreciated the ones that had a couple of sentences about Laura, about a memory that she had had with them. The Hallmark cards that just had the Sapi saying and the signature, I did appreciate. And I very much appreciated when someone could tell me a memory that I didn't know about Laura, because I wasn't going to be making future memories with her. So I treasured those types of stories and the connections that she had made. So that would be something that I would highly recommend, is to take those few extra minutes. So we have a number of really great questions here, and we'll try to get through many of them. And I will, in a follow-up email, I'll pick some of the writing prompts that Faith has on her website as well, and actually put in the name of the authors that she's recommending with the recording of this session. So don't worry if you didn't get that. Beth asked, is there anything being done to advocate for religions to teach that it is okay to grieve and talk about the losses when they are incurred? Too often I have met people who have said they are okay, as their child, spouse, etc., is now in heaven, and they figure they will be happy about their death because of that. Wow. That's a tough one. Faith, have you experienced, those types of reactions when you've talked to other people who are grieving in your hospital experiences?
That's a big question. Uh,
It is.
I think in my hospital experiences, I have not discussed religion with anyone. They do have at the hospital, they do have spiritual care providers. And I think those probably are the best people to speak with.
Mhm.
It is occasionally I will hear people say, my child's in a better place, or it was his or her time to die. I have a very hard time with that. I don't believe that. I do believe in God, but I don't believe that God wanted my child to suffer. I don't believe he or she wants any child to be suffering. And I think there are just times that circumstances are beyond one's control. And I do remember I didn't go to church for a while after Elizabeth died. I was just really too bereft, and some of me was angry. But in time, I joined a choir, and I found out that that worked very well because I was in a community within a community. And our choir actually was up in a loft. So I could see people, but they couldn't see me, which was really helpful because I would feel, and I would notice people looking at me sort of like poor Faith, and I didn't want that experience. So joining a joining a choir, I still could have the experience of being in a church. But singing, I know I'm a little bit off topic, but singing was one other thing that helped me. You bring in a lot of air and into your body, and actually you can grow sort of physically stronger singing. And it was very, very uplifting for me. So my experiences are very limited. Perhaps people just haven't spoken to me that much about God and death. I don't know if you have had other experiences, Susan.
Well, when I've given a few book talks, I have had some women come up to me and say they know that Laura is in a better place. And I've actually gone back and argued with them, because my whole conversation is about what are things that are good to say and what are things that are not so good to say. And granted that changes based on each person, because each person has a different perspective that they process grief. But I do believe putting your own religious views on someone else is not a good thing, no matter what topic it is. I think it's great that some people have such a faith that it helps them deal with the emotions. Um, but I think in general, pastors and priests and rabbis, they just need more education in general about grief. I mean, even social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists. Um, I mean, grief is about mental health, but I think grief still is a very special topic that has its own language. And it's really not a topic in education that is um, focused on. And it's not something that is very sexy. And it's uncomfortable for a lot of people because of their own mortality fears. And so, I mean, now that I've immersed myself in writing about grief and having experienced Laura's death and read so much, it doesn't scare me. And so my social media feed, probably like Faith's, has a lot about grief and resilience and death and loss. And so I'm immersed in it, but the average person is not. And so we have a long way to go. So another question is, what do you suggest for the pre-situation where death is not imminent, but a challenging diagnosis has been made, such as cancer metastasis, a return to a cancer journey?
Mm.
Um, that's a large question also.
Right, right. Um, I'm thinking this person means broader, perhaps, than just writing. Writing can certainly be one component to help you process what's going on at that time. Um, I think getting some help with what they call anticipatory grief. Grief, you can start to grieve even before your child or your spouse or your sibling has died, because if, for example, someone has metastasized cancer, you know it's quite rare that this person will survive. And you can hope for it, of course, but it's sometimes the reality of what's going on hits you as a kind of grief, and it's obviously a different kind of grief than um, after someone passes. So I think it'd be really, in my world, very helpful to see a therapist or a rabbi or a minister to talk about that grief that you start to feel. I think also with the individual, it's really important to do as many special things as you can. And for example, we were very lucky to take a Make a Wish trip, and that memory will always be with me. And I know Elizabeth loved being on her trip, even though she was fairly weak. We were able to go to an island. She was able to be next to the sea, which is where she loved to be. She was even able to, lie on a float. I was next to her and she could bob up and down in the waves. So I think some trying to find some ways to be able to celebrate that person's life while they're with you. And also in small ways. I remember one time I was in the hospital and Elizabeth was so enormously disappointed. It was a Friday night. She had been there all week and she really, really wanted to go home for the weekend, but her cell counts were way too low and she couldn't go home for the weekend. So I ended up, a child life specialist came in to spend a little time with her, and I went out and I got her favorite dinner. She fortunately had an appetite again at a nearby place. We chose a movie. I still remember that night watching the movie and laughing for the first time in a long, long time. And I just felt joy that she could eat this meal that all week long she had been so sick she couldn't have possibly eaten that meal. So you can have good moments, and I think that's something to really concentrate on. You may or may not be able to take a trip with your loved one, but you can always have really good moments. And so I think to think of creative ways to have good moments with them, those memories will stay with you forever.
I think that was such a wonderful answer. Um, And I think what I can contribute here is, even though Laura's death was so sudden, so it was not something where she knew about her mortality. Um, but I've since understood that when people have cancer diagnoses, or terminal illness diagnoses, one of the challenges is that people, what happens is the friends and the family will back off, and because it makes them uncomfortable. And the reality is, the person that's going through the illness, they know of their own potential mortality. They know that this is serious. It's not like the friend coming to say hello to them is going to make them sadder. It's going to make them happier. It's like when we faced the loss of Laura, the last thing we needed were friends to pull away from us. We wanted to keep them close. We wanted them to look at us the same way. We didn't want to be defined as the parents who lost their daughter suddenly from a cancerous brain tumor. We still wanted to be part of this, of our social network. And fortunately, we had people that allowed us to do that. But that's something I think that just needs to be understood more, that just because it makes you feel uncomfortable doesn't mean that you should not show up for the people in your life that are having struggles.
I
Showing,
agree with that.
showing, um, showing up, don't ignoring the person, listening to what they're going through and not judging how they're behaving, and not trying to fix the situation, which is the key reason why we feel so uncomfortable, right? No one could fix my problem. No one could bring Laura back to life. And because of that, they probably wanted to avoid me. And fortunately, yeah, so I've learned, show up, listen, don't fix. So we have a question from Louise. What are your thoughts about writing using a computer? And also, what are your thoughts on capturing your stories and feelings by narrating them? Well, I can answer that from my perspective. Is I think all of those are amazing ways. Any which way works for me. In fact, there have been times when I've taken out my iPhone and typed a tome of writing on my notes app. Somehow, by not being in front of a keyboard and that blank page and just typing one finger at a time, somehow makes my ideas come out in a freer flowing way than making sure I have the right punctuation and capitalization and grammar. And I've learned, there are many books that talk about just free writing, free form. Don't worry about the punctuation, just kind of vomit the words out. I've never been able to do that to the extent that I would like, but it's something that I can understand, where it becomes a gut release of your emotions versus the cerebral part of your brain taking over.
Mhm.
Okay, any
Sure.
that?
I write on a keyboard a lot. I journal, but I write a tremendous amount on the keyboard. And after reading many of my journal entries, I would then take um, not my journal entries verbatim, but I would write about them by typing them and starting, some Word docs. So I'm very comfortable writing with a computer. And I think just to figure out what works the best for you, if you want to narrate and record, if you're someone who wants to use, a talk to type program, so you don't actually have to do the typing, that is fine. If you're someone who wants to record, to go ahead and do that, or to write in your journal, whatever works well for you. And write in different places. That's another thing. You don't have to sit and write at a desk. You can write at the kitchen table. You can write at an outside table. You can write in a Starbucks. You can write at a friend's house. Whatever environment is welcoming for you.
Great. So there are two more questions that I'll answer, and then we have just a couple things to wrap up. During the pandemic, so many people lost loved ones and didn't have a proper ritual or connection to others. How do you think writing can handle that for them? as writing is such a solitary activity. Should writing be a partnership with friends or relations on such a project? Wow, that's another great question.
Yes, it is a great question. And I think in that case, writing with friends or sharing your writing with friends, I didn't bring that up before, but I think that's also very powerful. You need to find a friend who, and I'm sure you have them, who's very non judgmental. Because especially if you're writing when you're upset, your writing might jump topics quite a bit. It might not just be sort of flowing. It's certainly not going to be polished yet. But if you have a friend who can really sit with you and help to bear the unbearable with you, that is another very, very healing way to share. Another thing that I did do, and I didn't bring it up, but there are group writing classes. I took some group memoir writing classes. I live in the Boston area, and there's a place called Grub Street. It's sort of an unusual name, but and I actually Grub Street does do online classes now because of the pandemic. And I wrote I did two courses on writing as a way of healing, one course on memoir, and they were so valuable. And you write in a classroom, or if it has to be Zoom, you write at home, and then you actually share what you're writing, and you probably anywhere from 10 to 15 people in the course. Most of them have very good leaders. And so I think that is really helpful. I also did a writing program at my local library one time. And you build up trust amongst these 10 or so people, and people often share stories where they're very vulnerable. So I think it's a great idea.
Great. And then one last question from Susan. When you write, did you know who you were writing to, or were you writing to yourself? Um, and I can answer that, I guess, for myself, is I tried to have an image of a friend, like a picture of a friend on my computer while I was writing, because I wanted it to be conversational, like what we're doing right now. I didn't want it to go into the academic, um, into the, an academic and very formal type of writing. Um, and it did help me when I would try to stray into that, more prose, or, more formal writing. So I would say, I think it's both writing for someone else, but in the end, it is writing for yourself. And it's, um, some days it was very easy to write, and then other days and other moments you had to take a break, um, because it gets into topics that you perhaps had not explored in enough detail. And so it was, as my husband said, I could have written 3 books in the time it took me to write the one. It was not a process of sitting down at the kitchen table and starting to write the book and going from point A to point Z. It was a lot more of putting stories together and then working with an editor to make sure that it was a story with an arc, with character development, um, the moment of tension and then the growth. I don't know about you, Faith. Did yours come out freehand and all within one sitting?
Oh, no. It took me years to write my story. I think when you're writing in a journal, I think it's very important to know that you're writing for yourself. And I, many of my journals, I will just keep to myself for forever. But when I knew I wanted to write a book, then I change perspective slightly, because I wanted to be able to engage my reader, and that's a different kind of writing. So I think it depends. If you're journal writing, very, very much for yourself. If you're writing in a course, it's often very much for yourself too. If you're starting a book, you do need to take into account which audience you're trying to reach.
It's very, very well said. I know my editor kept saying to me, you know, that story is great, but it doesn't fit into the narrative, and it doesn't, the reader doesn't need to know that part about you.
Mhm.
Keep it so that it's it's a very personal and real story, but it has a universal message, and that people don't get bogged down in some of the, you know, minute personal details. And I'm very happy that she gave me that advice.
Yeah,
Um,
it's very good advice.
because I don't think anyone in this day and age wants or has the time to read a 400 or 500 page tome about someone else's life, but it's pulling out those common threads that people want to understand, you know, because people, when they're reading my story, but they're really reliving a tragedy or a trauma in their own life. And so I think you want to keep it at that level where people can take out the lessons that uh, they're able to take out at that moment.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to see, Faith, did you have you know, a brief way to wrap up what, you know, your main point is, or what you want people to leave with?
I guess I want people to leave with that writing is one way to help alleviate some of your stress, and it can be a way to help you to, in time, make some meaning out of all that you've been through. And it can be, as I said, different ways: writing for yourself, writing in a group, or writing knowing that you have an audience out there. Do what's best for you, but any of those approaches you take can really help you in the grieving and healing process.
That's awesome. And I want to mention one quote that I just read and actually posted on social media yesterday that really struck me. It says, "One day you will tell your story of how you've overcome what you're going through, and it will be part of someone else's survival guide."
That's wonderful.
I'll read it one more time. "One day you will tell your story of how you've overcome what you're going through, and it will become part of someone else's survival guide." And I think that that is something that gives me so much meaning, to be able to have these conversations and to hear from even friends of Laura's who 11 years after, or 12 years after she passed away, are now processing her death in different ways. And that story has kept Laura's memory alive. And if I hadn't written the book, those memories, those interactions would not take place, would not have had the option of taking place. So I want to, it's, you know, about 1:10, and I want to end on time. I um, so appreciate you all coming and joining us today. And I'm looking forward to doing these monthly. I'm not sure what the next topic will be. It's still to be determined, but I'll make sure that you guys all know about them coming up. And I love having everyone keep in touch with me. Faith's book, Hope is a Bright Star, just got launched. It's on Amazon. Please take a look at it. It can also be purchased at independent bookstores, just like mine. And let's see, we're just, I'm sure both of us would love to keep in touch in any way. And um, that's pretty much it. I really thank you for asking such great questions, and we'll see you with the next one. Thank you, and thank you, Faith. I really appreciate your time and getting to know you more, and appreciate what you're doing in your message in your book.
Thank you. It was a joy to be here.
Great, thanks, and it's great seeing everyone's faces.
Lovely to see you.
Thank
Okay,
you. Thank
take care.
you.
Yep.
Well.